Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 395 of CryptoBiography, and I'm calling it Che. And I am doing some writing for next week. I was thinking about getting it done this week, but then this is the start of probably a pretty long story, and I just wanted to make sure I had all the pieces in place before I started sort of writing in in earnest. This is a subject that I wanted to talk about anyway, so I thought this would be a good time to do it. So my other podcast is UtiniCast, and on that we discuss Star Wars: The Old Republic. It's a role-playing game, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And the way I like to play it is I make characters that are cosplays, and typically they are, superhero characters, and even though it's a Star Wars game, I tend not to do Star Wars cosplays in them. I actually do outside of Star Wars cosplays because I find it a little more challenging to get everything looking right and so on. And I haven't done a lot of people who are actual historical figures before. In fact, this is really the first historical figure character that I've made over there. Except for a couple of stage personas, one of them being Freddie Mercury, for example. So, while I did do a Freddie Mercury cosplay, that feels a little different than actually doing an actual historical figure. And so I'm doing Che Guevara, the well-known revolutionary from the Cuban Marxist takeover back in like 1959. And of course, he's the famous figure on the poster. Like if you see that poster of the guy with the black beret, kind of looking serious with the long hair and the mustache and the beard, that's Che Guevara. And he was an Argentinian who grew up in sort of like an upper middle class family, although with a lot of sort of ups and downs. His family had some troubles with money at several points, and anyways, he had a very interesting life even before he became a revolutionary. And in order to do this character on SWTOR, I wanted to kind of get the character right, and to do that, I sort of did some research, and of course, I did some basic things like reading his Wikipedia page and so on. But I also read 3 books related to him. 2 of them were actually by Che. He wrote a number of books during his life. I read The Motorcycle Diaries, and I read Guerrilla Warfare. So the first one, Motorcycle Diaries, is sort of an autobiography of a period of time that he did basically right when he was about to wrap up becoming a doctor. And in fact, he sort of becomes a doctor sort of at the end of this period of time. And he sort of like just takes off with his friend on this really rickety motorcycle that's, like tubes and held together with baling wire. And they actually do fix it with wire many times. It breaks a bunch of times, and it's, they're going all over South America. And just fascinating. And the funny thing is, even though it's called The Motorcycle Diaries, the motorcycle is ridden so hard that it actually just dies at one point. They can't fix it anymore. And then they're just like literally just hoofing it around South America. And basically, they sort of get by on, first of all, there is sort of a culture of just sort of friendliness and, welcoming people into their homes and helping people out and stuff like that in South America. And so they did a lot of, sort of thumbing lifts and walking from town to town and catching rides whenever they can, and helping. They do help out people in return. They do a few odd jobs. Sometimes they get help because, he has some medical training, and they actually find out about these, there's some leper colonies. They visit a couple of leper colonies. He helps out with the people there. Really interesting life. And he certainly, he has a lot of, he actually has a lot of sort of empathy for a lot of people, especially for the poorer people. He visits this one mine, sort of against, they kind of had to do it on the down low. Essentially, the mine owners were actually fighting this union, and they meet some people who just have been completely just ground into the dirt by the mines and by the society around them, around the mines, essentially. And and he sort of gets this deep and abiding sort of desire to sort of, help people out, to try to make it so that people aren't being oppressed. And speaking as an American, it's you get a lot. I mean, he definitely he really does not like the United States of America, because the United States of America was really effing around with all of Latin America by this time, and they knew it. In the United States, it's not taught very well. You can learn about it, but you kind of have to go out of your way to learn about it. It's still known facts and stuff, but you really have to go out of your way to actually find out about this. So anyway, so it's interesting to sort of see the Motorcycle Diaries, and he sort of he doesn't exactly become a revolutionary exactly by the end of that, but he's really close, and he definitely is sort of headed that way. And you could see how someone who had the experiences that he had in the Motorcycle Diaries went on to actually become a guerrilla fighter. And so the second book that I read of his is Guerrilla Warfare, and he wrote this, after the Cuban, his experiences in Cuba, where he helped Fidel Castro, take over Cuba from the American backed dictator. There were a lot of American-backed dictators in Central and South America and in the Caribbean, and that was one of them. And Che was one of the main people who helped them. Actually led the armies in several cases. He actually, helped take over one of the main cities that ended up being really key to the guerrillas actually winning the war. And he's, he was revered in Cuba, and still is to some degree, and was for decades after as well. And so he wrote a book about guerrilla warfare, and that's where I sort of learned some of the other things that were sort of interesting about him. So how he felt warfare should be conducted in this sort of situation. And then I also read not another book by Che. Those two were both by Che. The third one is a biography of him called Che, A Revolutionary Life. It was written in 1997. And it was interesting because apparently the author had done a bunch of research and had contacted Che's widow and some of his other relatives and some of the people who knew him, and really really did a good job apparently of getting the research done. And it came out right around the same time. And we know it was referenced in the book, so it must have been right after it happened. But apparently, Che's bones were finally rediscovered in 1997 and returned to Cuba, where he sort of was buried, in honor. And it's really fascinating. So learned a lot about Che, I would say so after Cuba, he did a couple of rebellions that were sort of in Africa, and then he came back from those. Those were unsuccessful, and there's some reasons why. And then he went down to Bolivia, and that's of course where he eventually was killed. I learned a lot. The Americans were, of course, backing the Bolivians. They are also backing some of the people, in Africa who are doing the oppressing in Africa as well. Anyway, it's you learn a lot about America by studying this sort of history. The interesting thing for me when it comes to that is I look at his guerrilla warfare, and he really did sort of take the lessons of Cuba, and he just sort of tried to apply it to other, sort of guerrilla fights, or he felt that that was sort of the way to do a guerrilla fight. And I kind of felt it made me understand that the way that like the way that he thought was a little like it was a little too narrow. He definitely did not like really take into account the fact that the different situations in the different countries would lead to different sort of fights that would have to be done. They tried to do the guerrilla warfare in Africa, but because there was a language barrier, because the landscape was different, and so on. There was there was quite a few reasons why they just weren't able to get any successes going there. When it comes to Bolivia, they had a little bit maybe more of a chance to do it the same way, but because they were doing the same sort of fighting, and because they never they sort of started off on the wrong foot, and because they started off on the wrong foot and they never really got onto the right foot, they were never able to sort of get the successes that would have led them to potentially actually taking over. Instead, it was always like taking a step back, taking a step back, taking a step back. When it came to Cuba, they had the Bautista government. The dictatorship was really holding people down. Like if you've seen Godfather 2, there's references to this period of time. Like so. When Michael Corleone comes to Cuba, this is right during the Marxist Revolution, and it's true that like a lot of people around the world really didn't give them much of a chance of succeeding, even when they were actually like taking over parts of the country and certain important cities and so on. A lot of people just didn't think it would actually happen in the end, but of course it did. And that sort of happens right there in Godfather 2. Like that's an actual. It literally does happen over that New Year's Eve is sort of like a very pivotal time, and then Bautista just has to take off. And so when it came to Cuba, though. So there's the Bautista regime, like lots of bad blood. You remember that there had been the American-Spanish War, and a lot of that was done in Cuba, and there was a whole bunch of bad blood because of the support of the Bautista regime by the United States. And so when the Cubans came over with Fidel at their head, who was a very charismatic leader, and Che, by all accounts, was charismatic as well. But he was a lot more like doctrinaire. Like he had some definite ideas about like what they should be backing, like what should be happening with the government when it was done, when they took over, like how the war itself should be conducted and so on. Like he's Fidel, you can sort of see from the autobiography, or not the autobiography, but the biography of Che. At least what I've read was how I read it was that you could see that Fidel was like, yes, he was a Marxist and he was doing that, but he was a lot of it was he wanted to be the leader, and he wanted to be the head, he wanted to be the chief, and this was more about him being the leader than it was about really creating a communist regime or anything like that. And I get the sense that like it was mostly like because America was so very, pro Bautista, and then anti-communist, like it sort of pushed Fidel into that sort of role. Like he would have been just happy being another autocrat, I believe. Just another autocrat, but he sort of like got pushed into sort of the Marxist Leninist sort of thing. And and but Che was part of that too, because he was in fact actually Marxist. Like he really believed in the Marxist cause, and so he was actually actively sort of pushing Fidel in that direction. And in fact, Che being given a couple of important governmental roles in the Fidel regime once they won, was in fact part of what alarmed the United States and a lot of other Western countries, that Cuba was in fact becoming communist. Even though Fidel was keeping as far away from the communists as he could, but then he kept getting pushed more and more towards them because of his hand was forced by the reactions of the United States and so on, which is interesting because as a United States citizen, you always heard about Fidel as a communist, blah blah blah. Well, turns out yeah, he was a communist, but he was a communist because the United States really didn't give him much choice. He had to get in bed with the Russians and so on, and I think he would have been very happy to have just been another autocrat, sort of because he did a lot of spouting for the cause sort of things, and doing some things that were sort of basically socialist or basically communist. But when it came down to it in the long run, he just wanted to be in power, clearly, to me, it seems like. Anyway, for Che, he was in the government for a while, and then he just sort of realized he needed to be out there in the front lines, and he wanted to be in a guerrilla war again. The difference, though, is where the Cubans actually had other Cubans. Che was sort of an exception with the group that came in. Fidel actually led mostly a group of Cubans, and then some other international people. At the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, which means they had local contacts, and they had a cultural connection, and they and all that sort of thing. And so when they started getting wins at the beginning, they actually started getting help from people who had hope that if these guys actually do win, things could actually potentially get better for us. That's what they wanted. And as that sort of ended, it took a long time, and it was a very slow process, and it was a very dangerous process. It's kind of amazing that it worked at all. But eventually they were sort of able to get enough wins, and every time they win, they would try to make it a win where they could actually gain new weapons and new ammunition. They were always scrabbling for more weapons and more ammunition. In Che's book, Guerrilla Warfare, one of the things he talks about is having the support of the people in the area, but also when you do have a win, it can only be really considered a win if you get more guns and more ammunition from the win. If you just kill some of the enemy, but then you can't go and take some material out of the area, then it's not really a win in terms of guerrilla warfare, which is an interesting idea. But unfortunately, when it comes to both the Africa campaigns and then in Bolivia, they really didn't have any wins to speak of, and they really didn't get. And they had a few wins, but for the most part, they were constantly just on the back foot, and not gaining strength, but actually losing it. And because of that, they weren't getting support of the people around there. Plus, there was the language problems in Africa, and in Bolivia. One of the other problems was that they didn't come in with Bolivian people. It was just all international, sort of, a lot of Cubans, of course, because Che had a lot of Cubans behind him who adored him and really respected him and were coming with him. Not a lot of Bolivians. And then they came in without the one place where they might have had some sort of support from the beginning would be the Bolivian Communist Party, which was legal in the country at the time, but rather weak, but it was there, and they had some money and some sort of help they could provide. But instead, they sort of just came in and just sort of showed up on their doorstep and sort of here we are, well, let's get this done. And so the communists actually just sort of more or less disavowed them, and so they were forced to get support from just completely outside of Bolivia. And but also from whatever they could inside Bolivia, which wasn't very much. And because they were not getting victories, and because they weren't having these strong ties to the people in Bolivia, they weren't also getting the support of the people in Bolivia, and which would have helped them, hide them, get more material, get better food, and so on. And the Bolivia campaign turned into a real nightmare, where it was just sort of like constantly just backing off, starving, like going up into the mountain passes, because Bolivia has, some of the Andes Mountains, and just, they're very freezing, very horrifically uncomfortable, and so on. Che was famously asthmatic, and so, of course, one of the factors that was difficult for him was like whenever he was in a country and he was getting an asthma attack, he either had medicine or he didn't. And if they were doing well, they could get a hold of medicine like they did in Cuba. But when they didn't, like in Africa and in Bolivia, yeah, it got really bad. So eventually, the Bolivians, which again were sort of supported by the United States, captured Che, and according to like at least the U.S. version of events, which it's hard to gainsay because Che is dead and has been long dead, and it was sort of killed semi-secretly. Apparently, they wanted Che alive. Because they, for their own reasons, basically to make sure that the world knew that they had captured Che, and blah 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 blah. Basically for that sort of reason, and also because they didn't want him to become a martyr for international communism or Bolivian communism, which of course he did. They killed him, and they tried to keep it secret. It took a few months before it was sort of confirmed that he was dead, and even then his body was hidden, and they did not find it until 1997 when this biography came out, which is pretty remarkable. So like 30 years basically, his body was disappeared, and they actually confirmed it because after he died, they chopped off his hands, preserved them, and then the way a few months later, the hands, some Argentinian forensic people were able to take the fingerprints and actually compare them to some fingerprints they had from their country, from Argentina. It's crazy. Anyway, so yeah, fascinating life. I definitely I admire some things about him. There's definitely some things to be admired about him. He definitely wanted to help people. I don't think I think he got very narrow-minded about it. Like, I don't think he felt like there was any other way other than Marxist revolution to actually make any sort of change that he would approve of, which is an interesting idea, because obviously you see situations around the world, and especially in the United States, where there are changes that need to be made, and going to the polls isn't exactly doing it. So it's a good question. Like, is there a way short of just a full out revolution? I'm not a really big fan of Marxist revolution anyway. I don't think autocracy leads to anything good. I don't think that you can take a country, upturn it with war, and then at the end put in an autocracy, and then sort of have it magically become, a socialist or Marxist or communist paradise where people are treated equally and stuff like that. Like, that's never really struck me as an accurate idea. Like, even, back in college, I read some, there was a couple of classes that required some readings of Marxist Leninist stuff and so on. That part never seemed to make any sense to me, because it's almost as though they just sort of assume it's going to happen. Like there's never any. It's not really based on anything. It's just based on like, oh yeah, well we got to put in this authoritarian regime at first to kind of get things figured out. But as soon as it's good, it just sort of will wither away, and then it'll be a communist paradise. Really, really, is that how it's going to work? Has that ever worked that way anywhere in the world? No, it's never worked that way anywhere in the world. So yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I think the idea of having like an armed rebellion is interesting, but why does it have to lead to an autocracy? That doesn't that doesn't seem to me like a step forward at all, and it doesn't seem like anything that's going to lead to another step forward either. So yeah, and Che himself as a leader is very interesting. Like he definitely like was, well, because he was very doctrinaire. He was very hard on himself. Like he only ate like the stuff that the soldiers around him were eating. He wasn't. He never gave himself extra. Like when he was in the Cuba governmental positions after the revolution, even though he was like the head of the banking system for Cuba for a few years, he had a commander's salary, which was a very low salary from based on when he was helping out with the army when they were doing the takeover, and so he definitely like he walked the walk. Like he did exactly what I feel a real leader should do. Like they should do, if you want to lead someone, and you want things are going to have to be tough, you have to take the tough along with them, and he absolutely did that. On the other hand, when something went bad with someone, like he was known to be like very strict about like punishments and stuff, and that included killing people. So he wasn't like crazy, but he definitely like if someone was like if they were in the guerrilla army and then they wanted to be out of the guerrilla army, that was a killing. That was a killing. That was a death penalty situation for him. He was also very strict about other sort of lesser punishments too. Which, when you're a guerrilla army, you can't put them in prison, so you have to find other things. Usually, apparently, one of the most common ones is you just made them go without food for a few days. Like they could only have water and maybe a little something else, but basically just water for a few days, and that was like apparently one of the most strict punishments that he had for them. And so yeah, so even though and he definitely wanted like things to be better. Like he wanted to, like when Cuba became, went under Fidel, then he wanted like all these sort of agrarian land laws to be passed and so on, so that all the land wasn't just being owned by these big companies that were supported by the Americans and so on. He wanted those agrarian land acts passed, and some of them were, and and he really actually did want the people who were the most downtrodden to have a better life, which is it's more than you can say of a lot of communist authoritarian types, because like you don't really see any examples of it like in the Soviet Union. Like they took away the land from from the big landowners, and then they just sort of held it by the state, though they didn't give it to the people to work for themselves. Then it just became part of the state, and it just became more power for the state to hold. That's not good. Anyway, so Che had a really interesting life. I found it fascinating. I really do recommend all three books. Actually, they're all really interesting. I'd say if you wanted to get inside Che's sort of head, Motorcycle Diaries is not a bad place to start. If you want to learn about his sort of military doctrine and what he thought about being a guerrilla and what that was like and how it should be conducted, then Guerrilla Warfare, his Guerrilla Warfare book is excellent. But if you just want his an overall thing of his life, and it is quite a long book, then yeah, Che, A Revolutionary Life is an excellent, excellent book. I really do recommend it. Yeah, thank you for listening. Went on a little bit longer than I expected, but like I said, I've been interested in learning more about Che. It's certainly a figure I knew, even when I was a kid, because you hear about, like, you see the poster, the famous poster, the famous picture that became a poster and became everything else, and you sort of hear, okay, yeah, that was a Cuban Marxist guerrilla named Che Guevara, but you don't necessarily learn all that much about his life. I mean, outside of the epic rap battles of history, which is surprisingly accurate. Obviously, some very basic, but actually pretty accurate, which they usually are, if you know what I'm talking about there. Anyway, it was a lot of fun to learn about him. It's kind of fun to actually play him in the game. I'm reasonably happy with how he looks. It's fairly accurate. I have a black beret for the character, and he's got a beard. And he's got, like, kind of spiky, dark, almost black hair. And as well as fatigues. I managed to make fatigues for him, even though they do not exist in the game naturally. You have to figure out how to do it. It was a lot of fun, though. So anyway, thank you for listening. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Blue Sky. I'm using X less and less, basically not at all at this point. And I appreciate you listening. Let's see. Words and Music, copyright 2025 by Brandon Starr. All rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.